welcome back to our online community content. If you would, after this episode, go ahead and take a moment and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And you can also visit our website, fccbrazil.org, where you can find all of our podcasts and any other online community content that we post. But most of all, I hope that you find this next presentation inspiring to lead you to a loving Father, a caring community, and a life-changing faith. Enjoy. The gospel is one story written to 4 different audiences. But we often read the gospel in only one way. We often read the gospel as a moral handbook for our lives. We often read it as only a practical application, only as a life application to figure out what we should do. And so oftentimes we read it to say to ourselves, this is what Jesus did, so this is what I need to do in my life. Now, don't get me wrong. We want to live our lives to be just like Jesus. But when I was younger, I used to wear a WWJD bracelet on my wrist. And as a 15-year-old boy who was just starting to enter into relationships and understand social aspects of life and everything like that, high school was much different than when Jesus lived 2,000 years ago. And so for me to go and to try and figure out what I should do in this situation by reading the gospel, it got very, very confusing. Now, like I said, we should often and always try to live our lives to be more like Jesus. But I thought to myself, surely there has to be another way I can read the gospel. Surely there's another way I can read the gospel, read the life of Jesus. Now, certainly all Scripture is useful to teach and correct. We're told that in 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is useful to teach and correct ourselves. But John, in his Gospel account, writes this in chapter 20, verse 31. He says, "But these are written so that you may continue to believe." When he says these, he's talking about his Gospel, the things that he wrote about in Jesus' life. "That you may continue to believe, and that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him you will have life by the power of his name." You see, John recorded his gospel for more than just moral wisdom. He recorded his gospel for more than just a practical life application handbook to hand out to people and say, here you go, here's how you should live your life, here you go, here's some life application. He did more than just write like that. You see, John wrote his gospel account to provide spiritual connection for the reader and for Jesus. That everything he wrote was making a claim about who Jesus was, maybe why he was doing the things he was doing, and how he was like God. And you see, Luke, in the beginning of his book, he says he's writing this as proof to a man named Theophilus. Mark wrote his gospel, very little detail in the life of Jesus and a ton of detail in the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. Matthew wrote his gospel to those who questioned Jesus' family line, his genealogy, all of those things. You see, the authors wrote to invite people to know Jesus. All of them wrote to invite people to know who Jesus was, what Jesus did, and for them to understand the identity of who he is. And so when we read to only find out the moral application, it's not so much incorrect, but it's not the intended purpose of why the authors wrote. The authors would think of things, in my mind, the authors would think of things like, if we want them to know Jesus' power, we should write a story about the miraculous healings. If we want them to know Jesus' compassion and inclusion, we should write about how he empowered the poor. If we want them to know Jesus' wisdom and his teachings, we should write about Jesus' parables. And so my challenge to you is that next time you read Scripture, next time you read the gospel, is that you don't read it to know Jesus' actions, but you read it to know Jesus' heart. In the Bible, it says that God doesn't look at our physical appearance, but he looks at our hearts. And so when we read the gospel accounts, instead of looking at Jesus' physical appearance or what he did or the actions he had, let us look at his heart for the people around him. And so starting this Thursday at noon, I will be getting on Facebook Live every Thursday at noon for however long it takes to be reading through the life of Jesus chronologically. The life of Jesus from his birth to his death to his resurrection. We'll be reading through all of that. 15-minute segments every Thursday, as long as it takes. And there'll be no teaching, no preaching, nothing like that. It'll just be public scripture readings to figure out more about the life of Jesus. And so I leave you today with the truth that when we read the gospel, we don't just read to know Jesus' actions, but we also read to know his heart, to know his ministry, and to know who he was to the people around him.